Okay, so I'm going to talk now about some of the things that we're going to hopefully get involved in, and we are involved in fact, to actually try and help address this together. So, what is metadata and what does it help us do? So, we've talked a bit about why we need it, and one of the important aspects of that is that it needs to be available broadly. It's all very well having it in one particular place, but actually if we're really going to leverage it, we want to make sure we can use it in other processes, in other systems beyond that. We need to be able to build reports on it that relate to that metadata as well. And so we have to be able to describe a lot of different things. We have, more technical-oriented metadata. You're looking at the schema of your database, what columns you've got. You've got things like where did that data come from? We think about things like lineage. But then you've, as I said, got the business context, which I think is really important, and things like reference data come into that as well, and knowing what business policies apply around access to that data. So really the last bullet, I guess, is the important bit, which is that it describes all about that context and classification of data so that we can actually deploy processes around it. And so these are some of the things that we'd need to be able to do this. Again, I think one of the points to make here is we're looking at this from an enterprise perspective. So not just within the Hadoop space, but this is something we need to do across all systems. And so we need a catalog that allows us to describe this data, to describe the terminology. And we need to engage with the business users, the subject matter experts that can help us do that. This isn't something you can just do from a technical perspective, but we actually need those skills engaged in this too. And as much as possible, it has to be something that can support automation. We can't go classifying every individual data set manually. We actually have to look at how we can build structures, build the metadata, and allow us to basically have processes that can automate that as much as possible. And of course, what we don't want to do is make everyone's life difficult. We want this to be easy. We want this to be something that everyone can do. And this is where I think open source has a big place to play, because it's something that we can all integrate with potentially in our products. So we have open frameworks and APIs. And this means that potentially those tools that are generating metadata, manipulating data, can actually collect those and actually store those in a very dispersed environment. And to get to the point where this isn't something that's proprietary, so within a particular product suite, maybe you have good integration today, but you probably have lots of those product suites. And when you start to want to use tools from different vendors and actually include new components in that, it becomes very difficult. So we get into this silo kind of approach. And if you want to know where data came from, it can be difficult because you don't always have a full view across all of those systems. Metadata can also change very rapidly, both in terms of its definitions and its values. And so having a distributed environment for that becomes important too. Okay, and this is really the nirvana of where we want to get to, which is many different tools all being able to exchange this metadata and be able to act on it, whether they're open, whether they're proprietary, and everyone can plug into that. Okay, so that's the, if you like, the backstory behind why we're doing this. And we're working on at the moment, so I'm from IBM and I'm working with a few collaborators from other organizations around something we've called the Virtualization Data Connector Project. And this is something that, if I move on to the next slide, is based around a data lake environment, which is not just Hadoop, but includes, for example, relational database systems or things like Netezza as well. And an important characteristic of that is that we also have a lot of knowledge, a lot of information around things like the business terms and the definitions of what we're working with, the classifications. And in a data lake environment, some of those data sources, if you like, need to be viewed in one way by one particular set of users, and maybe in a different way by a different set of users. So you might have a technical person who wants to access a particular data source that's in the data lake that literally wants to see maybe all the values in those tables with all their technical terms. You may also have a business user to which a lot of that data actually isn't relevant at all. And then on top of that, you have to be able to control things so that they're only allowed to see what they should. So for this collaboration, we've been working through use cases and designs, and we've come up with this, if you like, MVP. And unlike maybe some of the presentations this week, this isn't stuff that's out there at the moment. This is stuff we're very much working on at the moment, and we're keen to collaborate with people. So as we go through these slides, if you have ideas, feedbacks, then please get in touch. We'll be going through everything on the Gyrus system for both Apache Atlas and Apache Ranger, and working with those teams as we move those open source components forward. And the mailing lists as well. Okay, so you've probably heard quite a lot about Atlas this week. It's something that we started looking at, I guess, in about May 2015. I know I'd looked at Falcon myself a little bit before that, and one of the characteristics there was capturing metadata around the data sources and effectively the lineage flow from one place to another. Atlas came out of a collaboration that I know Hortonworks were engaged in early 2015, and the vision was to provide an open governance platform. And when we looked at that, that was absolutely what we felt was important, and so we've been very keen to get engaged with that community. Atlas itself basically has a sort of type-agnostic metadata store. It has REST-based APIs, it has some message-based notifications, it has a UI, and it has some integration out of the box if you look at stacks like HDP with quite a lot of Hadoop components. It also has support for Apache Ranger, and Ranger is, if you like, an enforcement technology. So this allows us to govern access to data at the point of use. It's Apache Ranger here allows us to do things such as control whether someone can access data. It allows us to do things like anonymization when data is accessed, potentially things like row filtering. It's a very open system. Plugins can be built for all kinds of different technology. So although there's some out of the box, anyone can go and develop a plugin for their particular technology. More recently, there's been some integration between Atlas and Ranger. So we have these tag-based policies that you may have seen in previous talks, and that allows you to use the classification of data that you have in Atlas to actually govern access then in Ranger. It also does auditing. So with those audit events, you can potentially do things like compliance reporting. And obviously, there's more at the link. So for this particular project, these are the components that we actually have in place. So if we start at the top, we've actually put together a couple of use cases we're looking at for the MVP. So this is things such as, I'm a business user, I want to search for a particular list of data sets that are interesting to me based on some of those characteristics, so some of that metadata, if you like, that's in a catalogue. And as well as searching for that data, perhaps I want to preview it, and then I might want to consume it in some kind of reporting tool. So we have at the top a search, or if you like, some kind of report type interface. That could be an existing tool, or it could be, maybe it's something that we could add in Atlas as we move forward. This is very much a discussion we're kind of going through at the moment. On the right-hand side, I'll start with the easy parts, if you like. We've got Apache Atlas, and that's going to be our metadata store. We chose that component. It looks absolutely what we think is important and fundamental, and we'd like to see adoption, hopefully, of that across many, many different products. We're using Ranger for the security enforcement. Apache Solr is basically where audit logs from Ranger and Ranger plugins will get reported to. But on the left side is an IBM open source component. We've got this thing called GuianDB. It's actually based on Apache Derby. And what it allows you to do is I think I've got a slide on this actually. Let me just go forward a sec. Okay, let me talk about GuianDB. So this is an open source component that has a federated model. So we can actually define multiple data sources. So you could, for example, take an Oracle database, you could take a file system, and then you can expose a virtual view that cuts across both of those. We're actually, for this MVP, only doing a single view, but what we are doing it for is provide a single point of control. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in another diagram. So we'll talk more about Guian shortly. And in this particular MVP, the two sources that we might use could be a relational database system and a Hadoop system. But the important thing here, perhaps, is that the enforcement is in GuianDB, so that's where there'd be a plugin that talks to Apache Ranger. Okay, so why did we choose these particular components? Well, firstly, I think open source is crucial to the success, and we want an ecosystem around that. There are also two active communities, and it's been really good, I think, this week to see what seems to be a lot of interest in Atlas and Ranger. I know all of the talks have pretty much been full on those particular subjects. And I know walking around the expo as well, there's been some interest in, I think, people asking questions around how those components relate to some of the existing proprietary or open solutions. Atlas itself is a great starting point. There's a very flexible type system that you can build on. You can define your own types. And Ranger itself as well is very established. It came from the acquisition of XA Secure. It has great support in the Hadoop environment. It's very pluggable. So when you start looking at what do you want to do to enforce access, Ranger is a great starting point. And the two teams have worked together as well, which is obviously a benefit. We can also use them independently of the Hadoop stack. I think that's going to be more important moving forward. As I said, we want to go outside just Hadoop. So this is the scope of the MVP project. It's a slightly, maybe the color choice wasn't the best on this particular chart, so apologies for that. So the main thing to point out here is we've got a little bit more detail about the interaction. So let's start with the data lake repositories. So these here will be where the actual real data, if you like, that we want to expose sits. These might be the three that we'll use for our particular MVP, which we're working on, but there's no reason why it couldn't be pretty much any sort of SQL or Hadoop-based data source. These are purely examples here. There's no reason why anything else shouldn't sit here. It's all actually being surfaced through this component called Guian. And this is the Apache DB thing I referred to earlier. And what this allows us to do is it has sort of connectors for many of these different technologies, and also generic JDBC connector as well. And all of this data will be surfaced up here via JDBC. So applications such as a user interface, which might set up here, will come down through JDBC to this GuianDB level. Now, when a user comes in and is trying to access data here, we have a Ranger plugin, and that Ranger plugin is responsible for applying policy enforcement. So am I allowed to actually access this data? Could be an example. And that's something you can do before you even execute a query. You know who the person is, or you know what their role is, more crucially, and what they're trying to access. But also, there's certain policies that apply afterwards. So this is where you might do things like masking or filtering of the actual data. And so we're also able to do that here. And GuianDB, this engine, actually has already plug points for doing things both before and after execution of queries. So it was a good starting point to take this kind of approach. What's worth emphasizing, though, is that each of these pieces are independent. So although for this initial work, we're doing things with GuianDB, any interfaces this has with other components are completely open, as well as this itself being an open project. So yeah, potentially you could put in here Cisco, Denodo, other virtualization type technologies. Okay, if we go further across towards the middle of this, in this section, we have what's called a virtualizer component. And I was referring earlier to the fact you might want to surface data in different ways to different kinds of users. So you might want a technical view of your data, and you might want more of a business-orientated view. So what we have is when a particular data source is created in the data lake, there'll be some events generated, and for certain kinds of events, certain kinds of data, let's say it's put in a particular zone in the reservoir, a zone that's maybe suited for data scientists or whatever, we'll trigger off those events and we'll go, okay, we want to create a new virtual view, and that's what GuianDB supports. So there's interaction here when these events come in from Atlas over here to actually go and say, let's create a virtual view in GuianDB. Once we've created this virtual view, we'll then also store that over in Atlas, and that's all about, we need to have that as a full catalogue of all the resources that we've got in our reservoir. Okay, that pretty much describes that environment. There's a few little pieces here we'll get onto perhaps later, which is, if you know Ranger, between Atlas and Ranger there's some integration around tagging. This is where you might classify your data in Atlas as SPI, for example, or you might have a data expiry tag associated with it. And that information feeds up to Atlas through this process. In our particular picture that we've got here, we're talking about making some changes here, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of our ideas around Atlas and Ranger in the next chart. And that same applies to some of these other pieces. There's also various things not on this diagram, actually, they're over here. Audit login and LDAP. So LDAP obviously for user directory, and effectively Solar up here. Okay, we covered most of this earlier. This is really just to give you a view of this box here is Guian. These are the underlying data sources, so Netezza, Oracle, etc. Our piece here that talks to this and creates these virtual views, and the notifications that come from Atlas, and actually recording what assets we've created back in Atlas. So Atlas is central to what we're doing here. And I think I do want to emphasize this point really, which is we've just chosen one component. It is open, you can go and look at it. It's, if you search for GuianDB on the web, that's G-A-I-A-N, you'll find out more about it. But this is purely as an example, so you can plug anything in here. So when we started looking at Atlas and Ranger, we realized there are some gaps that we think we need to make this a real kind of enterprise-ready component. And perhaps one of the most important aspects there is actually a glossary. So it's actually the way you describe the data, the way you describe your business, the way you link those things together. And so there's currently a JIRA open, the author's in the room at the moment, which is Atlas 1410. And if anyone's interested in this and would like to review and comment on that proposal, then please do. I think the more feedback we get from people, the better. We're obviously working with the open community on that. The JIRA is out there for review, and we've got, we'll be spending development resource on making those changes and working with the community on that. What we need to do is get Atlas to parity, if you like, with many of the commercial offerings. Perhaps not in the UI, but certainly in terms of its core and how it actually, the data structures and capabilities it actually has inside. Classifications is obviously crucial when we get to actually enforcing access, and they can often be in, for example, a hierarchy. So you might have different levels of confidentiality, and there's a relationship between those. There's probably just one particular level of confidentiality you could apply to a particular asset. And in fact, often you may apply those classifications not so much to an asset, but to a term, to how something is described as, for example, an employee salary. There'll be some things we have to look at when we do this as well. If we're making the glossary richer, the current tag synchronization that we have between Atlas and Ranger needs to be a little bit more sophisticated. It needs to be able to navigate hierarchies of relationships that can actually present effectively a simplified or flattened form to actually Ranger, who can then enforce these access control rules. The key thing here, though, is it's all about making sure the metadata is what drives the governance. We want to be able to model the rules, the policies, the roles, the relationship to the business, and actually drive as much as that as possible without individuals have to go to different systems and actually put things in place to do that. And the glossary really is central to this. There's a couple of other areas that we're interested in looking at around Atlas. The top one, consumer-centric APIs. So this is all saying that different consumers of metadata have different needs. So what a business catalog UI may want to use in terms of accessing terms and relationships might be quite different to what an enforcement engine such as Ranger needs to access. If you're looking at an individual business term, you might just do a query on that. Ranger might want to pull a whole set of things and its related tags efficiently in order to be able to cache that so that it can apply enforcement down the line. So it could be quite a different interface that you have. So one discussion we're starting in the community is to have these consumer-centric APIs rather than necessarily just a single API for everyone. And they themselves will use, if you like, a common lower-level API. So that's to have a repository-level API, which I would say is more akin to what we currently have in Atlas, certainly in terms of the type system, etc. The other aspect is that there's a lot of metadata servers out there. There's a number of ones out there, currently commercial offerings, for example. And so whilst Atlas may be one store of metadata, it's not the only one. So we need to have a model where that can be distributed and you can have different repositories managing different parts of your metadata. And so to look at having a pluggable interface there that lets you put in other metadata stores is very important. In Ranger itself, the GuyanDB database engine that we talked about earlier, we're looking at building a plugin for that. I think that's my job next week, which is going to be fun. Obviously, we've got that in Hive, etc. already, and that's where the enforcement is. We're going to do simple things for the MVP, but we'll build on top of that. There may be some changes that we're looking at there in Ranger in terms of how things like filtering rules, etc. defined. That's another discussion we'll need to have with the Atlas and Ranger community. For user synchronization, today in Ranger, all of the users and groups basically are retrieved from LDAP. There's some search constraints you can put in place and a starting DN. But if you've got an LDAP server with maybe 100,000, 200,000, 500,000 different entries, and yet the solution that you're working with, this virtualization layer, may only have, say, 100 users, 500 users, then we're looking at how to optimize that, especially as the roles of people that are using this layer are pretty much defined in Atlas. So I think that relationship is, again, somewhere that we've got some gyros open and looking to have some discussions on. And that really gets into policy definitions in general. I think how Ranger and Atlas relate together is an interesting discussion, and I think that's a very broad one we'd like to have in the community as we enrich this metadata and link all of this metadata more tightly together. What I should emphasize, though, again, openness really, which is that we're talking here about Ranger. Obviously, we have products like Apache Sentry and other projects outside Apache. And so if we build new interfaces on Atlas, these need to be open so that any enforcement technology could make use of them. So if someone wants to perhaps use Sentry, that's absolutely fine. So we want to work with each of these projects, but also, just like all those projects are already doing, it's just to keep those interfaces open. Moving forward, a couple of other different areas. Understanding what data you've got. One thing that can help there is discovery. So to actually have a framework in place that allows you to actually kind of discover what is in your data. So to be able to describe it, to build that metadata around it. And so there has been some work going on in one of our teams around discovery. And so getting that into this ecosystem, I think, would be really important. Again, that has to be taken as a sort of pluggable type approach, So you have different algorithms that may be contributed by different teams. Standard models. A lot of what we've talked about so far is around having standard mechanisms for metadata, but also what's important is how you might describe a relational database over here is the same as how you might describe a relational database over here. And there's probably very little reason for them to be different. They certainly still have to be extensible. Some people will want to describe more attributes around those database systems, but at least let's start with a common set. So in the community, if we can come up with some common definitions, I think that would make everyone's job more easy to actually do that integration. From an infrastructure point of view, in the Atlas project, Atlas for a while has been working on Titan 0.54. That's been out a number of years now. There was work on Titan 1, but most of the new development work around Atlas is moving, not around Atlas, excuse me, around Titan is moving forward to this project called Janus Graph, which is a set of users and contributors around Titan that have, I guess they fought the project. There's been some concern about how the Titan project moves forward, and effectively that new work is going into Janus Graph. Some work was done actually by some fellow IBMers just last year and into this year in terms of providing an abstraction layer in Atlas so that we can actually put different graph stores and make use of that. So today I think that supports Titan 0.54 and Titan 1, but moving forward other graph stores such as Janus Graph could be included too. An area, again, we're not covering yet, but it's clearly an area that comes up in discussions, is API metadata. So actually making sure you can describe what you're passing over interfaces. I think that will be an interesting discussion to have in the Atlas community as well, and the relationship of Atlas to that. And lineage, this too is massive. There's been lots of questions around this week. I know I've spoken to a number of people around ETL tools and CDC and all that kind of thing. All of these tools that move data around, all of these processes that manipulate data, they're all generating stuff that's useful in terms of lineage, whether it's a description of a job, the design, if you like, or whether it's actually those nitty-gritty details of what happens in an I5 flow, and every change to every data element is a complete spectrum. And so we have support for lineage in Atlas today. We also have support in NiFi for lineage, and lots of products have support for lineage. I think as a community we need to look at how those different pieces relate together and how we can actually provide a consistent view across many systems, both at a business level and then a technical level of that lineage. So this is the vision. This is where we want to actually get to. And this is, I think every presentation probably has what they call an eye test slide. And interestingly enough, it's an eye test for me to read what's on here. So hopefully you can read through some of this. But certainly having a common catalogue that we can all use is crucial. I'm trying to read this now. It's really small. It's really small. And to have any tools that can basically access it. Automation, I think we've spoken about a lot before. Subject matter experts collaborating. Not something I put on the slide so far, but if you think about a catalogue, you think about colleagues using particular data sets, it would be pretty cool if you knew what other people were using, if you knew what ratings people had around them. So maybe that's something that we can look at in terms of our metadata server in future. So food for thought, I think, there in the Atlas community and how we link that in with our enhanced glossary. Industry standards, which is this bit here. If we can come up with common technical descriptions around things like databases, that's one thing. But actually, if we can start then to look perhaps at what different industries need. There are a lot of metadata standards out there. Of course, everything's different. So again, that's another interesting discussion, I think, to have in the community. Okay. So, in summary, what we're hoping for is we can have an industry-wide common metadata platform and build an ecosystem around this. And we want to go outside just Hadoop. I think that is a key point, that we've got some really, really cool technology here. Atlas has got some great stuff in it, Range has got some great stuff in it. This is something we can build on together and actually make this something that anyone can take up, anyone can use. And let's get that foundation layer in place, and then we can concentrate on other things on top that are actually using that metadata and look at the best tool for the job in those other spaces. And scalability, this is really important. Things like not applying policies to a particular resource or a particular asset, but this is starting to look at how you classify the data and to build those rules around those classification structures so that policies can then effectively be applied automatically. The good news is I think most people, certainly I've spoken to, think this is a good idea, which is great. And I think where we're at now really is this involvement thing, this feedback. So we have stuff in gyras. We've got work to do to improve those gyras. If you look at both Atlas and Ranger, there's wikis. There's an Atlas wiki. We're hoping that will be opened up soon and we can start to share some, if you like, higher level ideas maybe around how we approach this space in those projects on the wiki. All our gyras that we're working on or interested in this project have got this tag, and they've also got a parent, so we've tried to link them all together. And for any of you out there, technical, or especially in fact business, please do get in touch and look at these tags. In fact, involvement from those with business skills I think is really crucial in this space as well. A lot of these projects they're very technical. We have a tight technical community around there, but it's actually that business insight that becomes really important to make them a good solution that can actually be deployed and actually mean something in the enterprise. So don't be put off if they're too techy. And this is this last quote here: "Innovation happens best not in isolation but in collaboration." I stole this from the keynote that I went to yesterday, one of the keynote sessions, and I thought that is really, really good quote, and that's what we're trying to do here. So please get involved. Thanks. So we have a little time for questions, and just before getting into questions, we'll go back one. I will hang around after this talk, and also at 17:50 in room 4, there's a security and governance BOF, and that's an open session for anyone to come along to. I know the Atlas team are there, guys from the other presentation are there, so come along and ask questions then. So any questions? I don't know if there's a microphone around. No, there's no microphone, so shout loudly.
In the visual slide, you had the automation of metadata and classifying.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is it possible to classify data automatically?
Okay, so the question is, in the vision slide, we had some points around automatic collection of classification-related metadata. Is that something that's actually possible? I think it's partially possible. I think there will always be cases where you can't determine things completely automatically. And I think what we need to have there is an open framework where actually people can plug in new algorithms, the community can contribute to be able to identify different kinds of data and actually to push that into, for example, a metadata store like Atlas. So I think it's sometimes possible. And also you can make use of other data that you've got more broadly in the catalogue, so you might know how systems are connected, how terms and stuff are related, and infer the classifications from those. But I don't think you could always do it automatically. Any other questions? Yes?
As part of IBM, you know that within the InfoSphere suite there are tools for governance and data lineage. Why don't you use that tools? Is there?
So yes, that's correct. The question is within the IBM suite there are some tools for lineage and for catalogue, etc. Yes, we have a series of InfoSphere related products. We have products like IBM Governance Catalogue. We have our ETL engines, etc. They're proprietary, so they do have open interfaces, so they work great within that particular suite. But what we want to do here is actually say, what's become important is making sure that this metadata is open to all tools, so all vendors. And also the connectors, if you like, to those different systems to capture metadata or to access metadata. That's not something that any one company can actually build. We need to have an ecosystem where together we can all collaborate on putting that together. So I think that's really the direction that we want to move forward in, is making sure that that layer of metadata can be easily shared and we don't, if you like, lock it into those proprietary tools. Of course, we're taking inspiration from what we have in those tools, and those tools will always build on top, if you like, of what we've described here and offer added value. If you take something like IGC, for example, you have a very rich user interface experience. Who knows whether that will be in the open source components or not. But probably all of that lower level plumbing, all of those metadata definitions, that's really what the focus is on, making sure that that is all open. Any other questions? Okay, thanks everyone for your time. Hope this presentation was good. Enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you.